Okay. Hi, Year 11. So today this is kind of following on that documentary we started watching about the unification of Egypt. We're going to stop and we're going to actually do a bit of a deep dive on an artifact from that time. So today we're looking at the Narmer Palette. We're going to answer all those questions like what is a palette and who was Narmer. But first of all, let's just stop and have a proper look at it. So on your worksheet you're going to use today, there's actually a link to a 3D model of this. And the reason I put the 3D model there is because of the sort of stylized art that you see on the face of the palette. So you can see that the figures leap out from the surface of the siltstone, and we call that a raised relief. So we're going to go through the different types of relief. We can have sunken relief where the figures are sunken into the stone, but this is raised relief. And while we're looking at it, let's just stop. We've got two sides, so it's a double-sided artifact, and I think the two main features that leap out to you when you look at it are King Narmer himself. We know it's King Narmer because his name's actually up here. It's not in hieroglyphs. These are sort of primitive hieroglyphs. They're not quite the formalized hieroglyphs that we know and can properly read. These are sort of proto-hieroglyphs. So we're looking at something that's very ancient, and it predates the actual use of hieroglyphs by a few hundred years. So King Narmer, he's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, okay, and he's the largest figure on that side of the palette. You know he's powerful, and he's smiting an enemy. And we look at the second side. King Narmer's there again, and interestingly enough, if I zoom in, you can see he's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. Okay, so something's happened here, where he would adopt a new crown, or a new persona, or a new way of displaying his power. And probably the main feature on this side of the palette are these two mythical creatures with their necks intertwined, and there's some sort of well here, so a deeper sort of indent on the face of the artifact. So you'll have a bit more time to explore it and break down the symbols and meanings there, but I'll go through my PowerPoint presentation, and then I'll hand over to you guys to do your activity. So first discovered in 1898 at Hierakonpolis. That's the capital of Upper Egypt. It was found with a collection of other objects that had been used for ceremonial purposes and then ritually buried within the temple at Hierakonpolis. Gifts like the palette would be made as votive offerings. So I'll put that in italics. Is it something we're going to need to get used to hearing? A votive offering. So it's a gift to the god. Once the temple's full of these goods, the older ones would then be buried respectfully nearby. So that's how it came to sort of survive the thousands of years that it'd been carefully put in the ground. These are some examples of other objects, other artifacts that were found at the site. Okay, you can see another image of a pharaoh there. Okay, and other sort of ball-like things. There's a base for a stand for another artifact. So to answer the question, what is a palette? I've got an image here of like a modern artist's sort of paint palette, and that's pretty much what it was. It was for mixing up makeup before it would be ritually applied to the image of a god. And something we probably already knew about Egyptians before we started ancient history, before we maybe even did year 7, is that they have this funky eye makeup that you can see here with Elizabeth Taylor wearing the eye makeup. And if I go to the next slide, here's an actual Egyptian example. We've got Queen Hatshepsut, and she's wearing the eye makeup. Hopefully you can see my cursor, okay, around her eyes. And it actually had a function in ancient Egypt. It might have been antibacterial because it had a bit of lead in it. They probably didn't realize why that was a benefit because they didn't really understand bacteria. But one immediate benefit is if you have a black dark makeup under your eyes, it absorbs a lot of the light that might be reflected and bounced off the sand at your feet. So it's kind of like primitive sunglasses, but it also had like a medical benefit they might not have known about. But it becomes this sort of dressing up of the gods becomes a ritual. They'd have an image like a small statue or something like that of the god that they would make offerings to, and they might dress it up. They might put a wig or a robe on it, and they might also put the makeup on it. So the palette was used to mix up those materials, those ingredients. So it has a ritual function. It's ceremonial, it's not practical. It's a big heavy stone, it's not very practical if you're going to use it day to day as a makeup palette. And lastly, it's made of siltstone. We've got some other examples that were found at Heracleopolis. There's a mace head that has some similar imagery, and then another palette called the two-dog palette, or the Oxford palette, where one dog's head surviving there, and we know the other one would have been symmetrical. And a similar image and a similar well in the center, perhaps that's where the makeup was mixed. And they all sort of feature relief carvings. So relief is, to put something in relief is to make it contrast. So these shapes, these images that have been carved into the stone, they are contrasted because they leap out of the stone. Particularly in this image is a good example where the light source is to the side and you can see the shadows sort of cast by the stone leaping out of the face of the artifact. So we've got two types of relief carvings. The top here with the bird and the snake and the I didn't realize the feather has feet. So that hieroglyph is for I, the I sound. Doesn't always have 2 feet. I didn't realize that. So it's a walking feather, but I think that spells for it. Right, no idea what it means though. So high, raised, high also has the sort of word raised is another way to describe it. So it's raised out of the stone, or it's high relief. And then sunken relief is the example we have down the bottom here, where it's actually cut into the stone, sunken deep. And you get the same effect that shadows are cast, okay, where depending where the light source is, it still does stand out from the what we call, like, I guess, the background. So it does still have like a striking sort of presence. So throughout Egypt's long history, sculptors worked with 2 methods of relief carving. There's high and there's low. High reliefs were those carvings that stood out from the surrounding surface, which had been cut away. So imagine all the work that goes into carving, like removing the stone around the objects. So high relief or raised relief, it's more expensive, it's harder to do, takes longer. Sunken relief, towards the end of Egyptian history, becomes more common as there's less money, less stability in government. So high relief is when we look at that, we go, wow. High reliefs were those, I already read that. So low reliefs were images that were cut or sunk into the surface of the material. These relief carvings were considered eternal, so both methods considered eternal. So this method was often used in temples, tombs, stelae, so tombstones, and sarcophagi. So I've got a slide here that's sort of just a quick summary of all the, I guess, what we'd call propaganda. So all the messages of propaganda. So Narmer promoting himself, promoting his actions, his power. So you're going to go through it and look at it in detail, but he connects himself to Horus. Right? There's a figure on the palette that you might notice that is the royal sort of god Horus. And then there's Hathor. There's actually 4 instances of Hathor appearing on the palette. And Hathor is sort of the mother of the pharaoh. Horus is the father, Hathor is the mother. He has a powerful stance. He's larger. We call that hierarchic scale. So he's higher in hierarchy and status and power. It's a simple message. If I go to... He's bigger than everyone else, so he's more important than everyone else. It's a nice, simple way of communicating that, particularly when your audience might not be literate. He's showing his power over Lower Egypt. So you're going to look at this in a minute, but you can see Horus holding... He's in the form of a bird. You can see him holding the papyrus reeds with a cord. And that symbolizes Horus, so this god of Upper Egypt, and he is subdued, or he's tied up or captured the papyrus reed, which is the symbol of Lower Egypt. So we don't need to read hieroglyphs, we only need to have a basic understanding of the symbols of Egypt, and we can actually understand the message that the Upper Egypt has conquered Lower Egypt. We see him wearing both crowns of lower and upper on each side. And if you have a bit more knowledge, you can actually recognize some of the people who are pictured in it. So his fallen enemies, we have the Lower Egyptians, but we also have Asiatic people from up towards modern Turkey, and Libyans to the west into the desert of Egypt, of North Africa. Down the bottom register, we see the bull that has broken through some city walls. So perhaps this is describing his final victory over the capital of Lower Egypt. And then we see, might actually have to go to it, the sandal bearer. So he's here on this slide in green. It's actually an official role. Might be interesting job. to carry the pharaoh's sandals, and they would clean his feet as well. But this is actually sort of like a prime minister under the pharaoh. So a very very important role, very intimate role, I guess, with you're close to power, but a strange one nonetheless. So I'll put up the PowerPoint of this so you can look at this in your own time, but this actually color codes and breakdowns all the sections. So I'll put both of them up. I won't stop and talk about it now. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was how this image sort of persists. So it is a simple message. You know, you put yourself larger, you put yourself smiting someone, and everyone quite quickly realizes you're communicating your power, your authority. So we're looking at the Narmer Palette from the 31st century BC. So a very long time ago. Pharaoh Seti I, he's using the same image. He's got his mace. He's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, though, in this instance. And he's holding his enemies by the hair. And he is smiting them. He's hitting them with the mace. And it's 1,800 years after the Narmer Palette, and that image is still being used. And then the last one on the right is actually a Roman emperor, Trajan. And he's obviously promoting himself in a way that the Egyptians would understand. And he's adopted the same stance, the same weapon. He has a more sophisticated crown, but he's still holding his enemies by the hair. You can see he's one-upped, or a few more than one-upped Seti I. Seti I has maybe 4 or 5 captives here. Trajan, who was a great Roman emperor and conquered a lot of new territory for the empire, actually his largest extent under him, he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, he's got twice as many as Seti I. Okay, so there's definitely a symmetry, and it continues for 3,000 years between Narmer, right, and even up to foreign rulers of Egypt who want to communicate in a way that Egyptians will understand. So I want you guys now to go to the classroom and complete the activity in the worksheet.